Let it ring, Ethan Caldwell said without even looking up, his voice smooth, dismissive, practiced. Calls like that aren't meant for people like you. The phone kept vibrating against the polished marble counter, a soft but persistent hum that somehow cut through the low jazz, the quiet laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. It was the kind of restaurant where a single steak could cost more than a week's rent, where deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars were whispered between sips of aged bourbon, and where people like Naomi Brooks were expected to move silently, efficiently, invisibly. She stood there for half a second longer than she should have, tray balanced in one hand, eyes flicking toward the screen, lighting up again and again with an international number she didn't recognize, but somehow felt she should. Around her, the room glowed in warm amber light, reflections dancing across tailored suits and polished shoes, power wrapped in elegance, control disguised as calm. Ethan sat at the center of it all, shoulders relaxed, confidence effortless, the kind of man who didn't just attend rooms like this, he owned them. Tonight wasn't just dinner, it was a negotiation, and not just any negotiation. This was with his largest international client, a deal rumored to be worth over $300 million, the kind of contract that could redefine a company's future overnight. And yet, when the phone rang, he ignored it. Again, Naomi turned slightly, setting down a glass of water at the edge of the table, her movements precise, trained, almost invisible, but her ears were not. They never were. She caught fragments of conversation, numbers, locations, languages slipping in and out of English, and something about that call, the rhythm of it, the country code flashing briefly before dimming again, tugged at something buried deep in her memory. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She had learned long ago that speaking out of turn in places like this didn't earn respect, it invited correction. Still, the phone rang again. This time longer. Louder. Or maybe it just felt that way. Across the table, one of the executives chuckled, making a comment about time zones and desperate clients, and Ethan waved it off with a small flick of his wrist, the kind of gesture that ended conversations and dismissed concerns in the same breath. If it mattered, he said calmly, lifting his glass, they'd email. The others nodded, because that's what people did around power. They agreed. Naomi's grip tightened slightly on the tray. Email. That word didn't sit right with her. Not with that number. Not with the urgency in the pattern of the calls. She glanced again, just for a second, long enough to notice something else this time. The language setting. The notification preview. A single word she hadn't seen in years, but recognized instantly. Her heart didn't race. She didn't gasp. She simply stood there, still, composed, while something inside her shifted quietly into place. Because sometimes the loudest moments don't come with noise. They come with recognition. And as the phone began to ring again, Naomi Brooks realized this wasn't just another call being ignored. This was a moment being missed. The phone stopped for a moment, and in that brief silence, the room seemed to breathe again. Conversations resuming, laughter returning, deals continuing as if nothing had tried to interrupt them. But Naomi did not move, because she knew that kind of silence, the kind that was not an ending but a warning. And right on cue, the phone lit up again, vibrating harder this time, insistently, like someone on the other end refusing to be ignored, and Naomi's eyes dropped to the screen just long enough to confirm what she had already begun to suspect: the country code, the language preview, the structure of the message notification. It was not random, it was not spam, it was precise, urgent, intentional, and dangerously misunderstood. She placed the tray down slowly on the service station, her movements controlled, her expression neutral, but inside her mind something was aligning, connecting fragments from a past she rarely spoke about, late nights with textbooks, audio recordings looping in, her ears, practicing tones and syntax until they became second nature, a skill she once believed would open doors, not lead her to carry glasses through rooms where no one learned her name. Across the table, Ethan continued speaking, outlining projections, timelines, expansion strategies, his voice steady, confident, unaware that the very deal he was describing was shifting beyond his reach with every unanswered ring. One of the executives leaned in, asking about confirmation from the overseas partner, and Ethan gave a small smile, the kind that signaled control without effort, saying they were aligned, that everything was already secured, that there was nothing to worry about. Naomi heard that too. And for the first time, something in her stillness felt heavier, not hesitation, not fear, but the weight of knowing, because the words she had glimpsed on that screen did not sound like alignment. They sounded like confusion, urgency, and something closer to withdrawal. The phone rang again, cutting sharper now, and this time a few heads turned, not out of concern, but irritation, as if the sound itself did not belong in a room this controlled. Ethan finally glanced toward it, just briefly, then away, dismissing it with a quiet exhale. And that was the moment something shifted inside Naomi, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for doubt. She stepped closer, just within reach of the phone, her posture still respectful, her voice calm but firm enough to exist. "Sir," she said softly, not interrupting, but placing the word into the space between his sentences. He did not look at her. Not fully, just enough to acknowledge a presence without granting it weight. "What is it?" he said, his tone neutral, efficient, already halfway back to his conversation. Naomi hesitated for half a second, not because she was unsure, but because she understood exactly what crossing this line meant. People like her did not step into moments like this. They observed them, served through them, disappeared after them. But the phone rang again, louder in her mind than in the room, and she knew this was no longer about protocol. "That call," she said carefully, "it might not be what you think." There was a pause, small but noticeable, a crack in the rhythm of the table. One of the executives raised an eyebrow, another leaned back slightly, watching, curious now, not because of her, but because something unexpected had entered the script. Ethan finally turned his head fully, meeting her eyes for the first time that night. Not with anger, not yet, but with a measured curiosity edged in. Disbelief, as if trying to understand why a waitress would dare suggest anything about a call he had already chosen to ignore. And in that single glance, the distance between them became clear, not just status, but assumption, expectation, limitation. He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, then gave a faint, almost amused smile. "And what exactly do you think it is?" he asked, the room quieting just enough to listen. Naomi did not look away, because this was no longer about being seen or unseen. It was about being right. And as the phone began to ring again in her hand, she answered quietly. "It sounds like they are not calling to confirm the deal," she said, her voice steady. "It sounds like they are calling to stop it." For a moment, no one spoke, and in a room built on certainty, that kind of pause did not belong. It stretched just long enough to make people shift in their seats, to glance at one another, to wonder whether this was still part of the evening or something else entirely. And Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the faint amusement fading into something sharper, more analytical, as if he were recalculating the situation in real time, his fingers resting lightly against the table, his gaze steady on Naomi, measuring her, not as a person, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "That is a bold assumption," he said calmly, his voice low but carrying, the kind of tone that usually ended conversations before they began. But Naomi did not step back. She did not apologize. She simply held her position, not defiant, not submissive, just certain, because the phone was still vibrating in her hand. And now the screen had shifted, a message preview flashing longer this time, enough for her to read more than a fragment, enough to understand the urgency beneath it. Her thumb hovered for a fraction of a second, then she looked back at him. "Sir, if I am wrong, you can have me removed from this room right now," she said quietly, her words precise, measured, leaving no space for misinterpretation. "But if I am right, this call is the only thing standing between you and losing that client tonight." The air tightened, not visibly, but in the way conversations stopped mid-thought and never resumed. One of the executives leaned forward, interest replacing amusement. Another set his glass down slowly, the sound of it louder than it should have been, and Ethan noticed all of it. He always did. Control was not just about speaking, it was about reading the room, and right now, the room was no longer entirely his. He extended his hand, not abruptly, but with quiet authority. "Give it to me," he said, and Naomi stepped closer, placing the phone into his palm, her movements steady, her eyes not leaving his, not challenging, just present. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time, Something flickered across his face that had not been there before. Recognition, followed quickly by concern, because now he saw it too. The language, the cinder, the escalation in the messages. He answered, bringing the phone to his ear, his posture still composed. But the room had shifted, every eye now subtly drawn toward him, even those pretending not to look. There was a brief exchange in English, his tone professional, controlled, but then the voice on the other end spoke faster, sharper, switching languages, and Ethan paused, just for a fraction of a second, a hesitation so small most would miss it. But Naomi did not, because she knew that pause. She had lived in it. The moment when comprehension falls just short of fluency, when meaning slips between words, and decisions hang in that gap. Ethan responded again, slower now, choosing his words carefully. But it was clear, the rhythm was off. The conversation was no longer aligned. Across the table, one of the executives shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was wrong without understanding what. Another leaned closer, whispering a question that went unanswered, and Naomi felt it then. The exact moment the situation tipped from controlled to critical, because the voice on the other end did not slow down. It accelerated, urgency rising, tone tightening, and Ethan's silence stretched longer this time. Not strategic, but uncertain, and in that silence, Naomi made a decision she knew would change everything. She took one step closer, just enough for her voice to reach him without interrupting the call, and said softly, "They're saying the numbers do not match the revised contract, and they believe they are being misled." Ethan's eyes snapped toward her, sharp now, fully alert, the room holding its breath as the invisible line between who was supposed to speak and who was not had already been crossed. And Naomi, without raising her voice, without breaking her calm, added one more sentence that landed heavier than anything else that night. "And if no one explains it correctly in the next few minutes, they are walking away." The shift was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, like a current running beneath the surface of a calm sea. And Ethan felt it before he fully understood it. The weight of Naomi's words settling into the conversation in his ear, reshaping every sentence that followed. He straightened slightly, his grip on the phone tightening just enough to betray that something had changed. "Hold on," he said into the receiver, his voice controlled but no longer casual, his eyes flicking back to Naomi. Not dismissing her this time, not ignoring her, but recalibrating around her presence as if she had suddenly become part of the equation. And on the other end, the voice continued, fast, precise, layered with frustration, and now Ethan heard it differently, not as noise, but as meaning, fragmented but urgent. He responded again, slower, choosing each word carefully, but the gap was still there, the slight delay, the missed nuance, the kind of misalignment that could cost more than money. Across the table, the executives were no longer pretending not to watch, their attention drawn fully now, the atmosphere tightening as confidence gave way to uncertainty, and Naomi saw it clearly, the moment where power hesitates, where certainty begins to crack, and she understood something else too. This was not just about translation. This was about timing, about precision, about saying the right thing before the wrong assumption became irreversible. She leaned in just enough, her voice low, steady, designed not to interrupt, but to guide. "They are referencing the third clause in the revised agreement," she said softly. "The one about the adjusted distribution percentages." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, recognition flickering again, because he knew that clause. He had approved it himself, but he had not expected it to be questioned like this. Not now. Not here. He repeated part of the explanation into the phone, but the response came back sharper, more urgent, and Naomi caught it instantly. The tone, the phrasing, the subtle shift that changed everything. She stepped half an inch closer, just enough to be heard. "They think the numbers were altered after their last confirmation," she added, her words precise, unembellished, and this time Ethan did not hesitate. He adjusted immediately, his voice firming as he clarified, referencing timestamps, documentation, intent. But even as he spoke, Naomi could hear what he still could not fully reach. The emotional layer beneath the language, the distrust building, the assumption forming, and that was the real risk, not the numbers, but the meaning behind them, the interpretation that could not be corrected with facts alone. She watched his posture, the the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his responses were beginning to stretch longer, and she knew they were running out of time, not in minutes, but in moments, because once a client decides to walk away, it is rarely about logic. It is about feeling unheard. And that decision, once made, does not wait. Naomi took a breath, steady and controlled, then spoke again, this time with a quiet urgency that carried more weight than volume ever could. You need to acknowledge their concern before you correct it, she said, her voice calm but certain. Right now they think you are defending, not listening. Ethan's gaze snapped to hers again, sharper this time, not in challenge, but in recognition, because what she said was not just accurate, it was strategic. It was the difference between a negotiation and a breakdown, and for the first time that night, he did something he had not done once since he sat down at that table. He paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice. He shifted his tone, softened it, and spoke again into the phone, this time not leading with numbers, not with correction, but with acknowledgement, and the effect was immediate, subtle, but undeniable. The voice on the other end slowed, just slightly, the edge in it easing, not gone, but less sharp, and Naomi felt the shift ripple through the conversation, the tension bending instead of breaking, the moment stretching just enough to allow something else to enter, something like understanding. And as Ethan continued, now adjusting not just his words, but his approach, the room around them remained silent. Every person at that table watching something they had not expected to see, not a waitress interrupting a CEO, but a moment where the balance of power quietly, unmistakably, began to change. The change in tone did not just travel through the phone. It settled into the room itself, subtle but undeniable, like the air shifting before a storm chooses not to arrive. And for the first time that night, Ethan was no longer performing control. He was practicing it, carefully, deliberately, adjusting not just what he said, but how he said it. We understand your concern, he began, his voice measured, slower now, giving space where before he had filled it. And you are right to question any inconsistency. Across the table, a few of the executives exchanged quick glances, surprised not by the words themselves, but by the way they were delivered, less dominance, more alignment. And Naomi stood just behind his shoulder, not stepping forward, not claiming attention, but listening with a focus that cut through every layer of conversation, because she could still hear it, the hesitation. On the other end, the lingering doubt, the kind that does not disappear with a single sentence. The voice responded again, still cautious, still guarded. And this time Naomi caught something deeper, not just the words, but the intent behind them. A phrase repeated twice, a subtle emphasis on timing, on when the document had been received versus when it had been revised. And that was it. That was the fracture point. Not fraud, not deception, but misalignment and sequence, a misunderstanding built on timing rather than truth. She leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. They think the version they approved is not the one you are referencing, she said, and Ethan did not question her. Not now. He pivoted instantly, asking for confirmation, referencing the exact timestamp of the document exchange, and on the other end, there was a pause, longer this time, not tense, but processing, the kind of silence that signals reconsideration rather than rejection. Naomi watched his posture ease just a fraction, the tightness in his shoulders releasing as the conversation began to find its footing again, but she knew better than to relax, because this was the moment where clarity had to be absolute, where one wrong assumption could undo everything they had just regained. The voice on the phone spoke again, slower now, asking for specific clarification, and Naomi heard the opening, the narrow window where understanding could fully replace doubt. She spoke again, gently, precisely, explained that the revision was an internal formatting update, not a numerical change. She said, they are reacting to structure, not content. Ethan repeated it, almost word for word, his voice steady, confident again, but different now, grounded not just in authority, but in accuracy. And this time, the response that came back was not sharp, not defensive, but measured, inquisitive. The edge softening into something closer to collaboration. Around the table, the executives leaned back slightly, the tension easing in small, almost invisible ways. A glass lifted again, a breath released, but no one spoke. No one dared to interrupt what was unfolding. because it was no longer just a call. It was a turning point. Naomi remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, but inside, she felt it. The precise moment where the outcome shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but decisively, because the voice on the other end said something different now. Something that had not been there before. "We see," followed by a pause, and then, "Let us review that section together." And just like that, the conversation moved forward, not away, not broken, but rebuilt, and Ethan nodded slightly, not to the room, not to the executives, but to Naomi, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words spoken that night, because he understood now what the room was only beginning to realize, that the person he had dismissed as background had just become the reason everything in front of him did not fall apart. The conversation did not end with relief. It deepened into something more precise, more deliberate, as if both sides now understood that what they were rebuilding required more than correction. It required trust, and trust does not return all at once. It returns in careful steps, measured words, and consistent clarity. Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, no longer leaning back in quiet dominance, but forward in active engagement, his voice steady, paced, aligned with the rhythm on the other end of the call. He repeated key points, confirmed figures, referenced documents with exact timestamps, and each time he spoke, Naomi listened, not for what was said, but for what might still be misunderstood, because she knew that language was never just about words. It was about intention, tone, and the invisible space between them. The client asked another question, this time slower, more open, and Naomi caught the nuance immediately. It was not a challenge. It was a request for reassurance. A subtle shift that meant they were no longer preparing to leave. They were deciding whether to stay. She stepped closer again, her voice calm, almost weightless. "They want to know if this adjustment affects their long-term share," she said, and Ethan responded without hesitation, explaining the structure clearly, this time emphasizing stability, continuity, and mutual benefit. And the response that followed carried something new. Not tension, not suspicion, but consideration. Across the table, the executives who had once filled the room with quiet confidence now sat in focused silence, watching not just the deal, but the transformation of it, because what had started as a routine negotiation had turned into something far more fragile and far more revealing. Naomi remained composed, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharpened with every exchange. She noticed the slight nod Ethan gave as he spoke, the way his tone now matched the cadence of the voice on the other end, the way he paused just long enough to allow space instead of rushing to fill it. And she understood what was happening. He was learning, not in theory, not in abstraction, but in real time, adapting to a moment he had not anticipated, guided by someone he had not expected to matter. The client spoke again, longer this time, outlining their understanding, confirming details, and Naomi felt the shift settle fully into place. The conversation had crossed the threshold. It was no longer about preventing loss. It was about rebuilding alignment. She nodded slightly, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself, because she could hear it clearly now, the absence of urgency, the presence of clarity. And when Ethan responded, his voice carried something it had not held before. Not just confidence, but respect. Not just authority, but awareness. And then it came. The sentence that changed everything. Simple, direct, unmistakable. "We are comfortable proceeding." The words traveled through the phone and into the room like a quiet release. Not explosive, not dramatic, but powerful in its simplicity. One of the executives exhaled audibly. Another leaned back in his chair, the tension dissolving in small, human ways. But Ethan did not react immediately. He held the moment, acknowledged it with a calm response, confirmed next steps, and only when the call ended did he lower the phone slowly. The silence that followed was different from before, not uncertain, not tense, but aware, as if everyone in the room had just witnessed something they could not fully explain. Ethan stood there for a second, the device still in his hand. Then he turned, not to the table, not to his executives, but to Naomi, and in that single glance, there was no dismissal left, no assumption, only recognition, because the deal that defined his night, his quarter, possibly his entire year, had not been saved by control alone. It had been saved by someone who chose to speak when silence would have been easier. No one reached for their glass right away. No one spoke, because the kind of silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, recalculation, and something far more uncomfortable than tension, perspective. Ethan lowered the phone slowly onto the table, the soft contact against the marble louder than it should have been, his eyes still on Naomi, not briefly, not dismissively, but fully, as if seeing her for the first time required more than a glance, required a pause, required a shift he had not planned for. Across the table, one of the executives cleared his throat, attempting to restore the rhythm of the evening. "Well," he said lightly, "that was close." A few small nods followed, a faint chuckle, the kind people use to smooth over moments they do not fully understand. But Ethan did not respond, not to them, not yet, because something more important had just interrupted a pattern he had followed for years. He stood there, composed as ever, but the stillness in him was different now, not calculated, not strategic, but reflective. And Naomi, already stepping back, already returning to the role the room expected of her, reached for her tray again, her movements as precise and quiet as before, as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just altered the outcome of a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She did not wait for acknowledgement, did not look for approval. She simply resumed her work, because that was what she had always done. She showed up, she observed, she acted when it mattered, and then she moved on, unseen. But this time, she did not make it more than 2 steps before Ethan spoke. "Wait." The word was not loud, but it carried, cutting cleanly through the room, stopping movement without force. Naomi paused, turning slightly, her expression calm, neutral, the same expression she had worn all night. But the room was no longer the same. Every eye shifted again, but this time not with curiosity, with attention. Because when someone like Ethan Caldwell says wait, people listen. He took a step forward, not toward the table, not toward his executives, but toward her, closing a distance that had existed long before this moment. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, but clearer. You understood everything they said. It was not a question, it was a statement, but beneath it was something else, something like disbelief, not in her, but in himself, in what he had overlooked. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone steady, respectful, but unafraid. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but real, the kind that happens when something shifts and no one rushes to fill it. One of the executives leaned forward slightly, watching. Another set his glass down again, slower this time, as if the smallest movements mattered more now. Ethan exhaled, a quiet breath that carried more weight than any speech he had given that evening. "And you knew that from the first call," he said. And Naomi nodded once, small, certain. "I recognized the language and the phrasing," she answered. It did not sound like confirmation. The simplicity of her words settled into the room. Not dramatic, not embellished, just truth. And that was what made it land. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then another, as if measuring something he had never thought to measure before. Not her qualifications, not her position, but her value, the kind that does not announce itself, does not demand attention, but proves itself in moments that cannot be rehearsed. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not in volume, but in meaning. "You did not just answer a call," he said quietly. "You changed the outcome of everything sitting at this table tonight." And for the first time, the room did not react with nods or laughter or polite agreement. It remained still, because everyone there understood that what had just been acknowledged was not part of the script. It was something else entirely, something that could not be ignored anymore. Naomi did not step forward to claim the moment. She did not straighten her posture or change her expression, because for her, nothing about what had just happened felt extraordinary. It felt necessary. And that difference was the quiet line between who she was and how the room had always seen her. She held Ethan's gaze for a brief second, then lowered her eyes slightly, not out of submission, but out of respect for the space she still occupied. "I was just doing what I could," she said simply, her voice even, unembellished, and that answer, more than anything else, unsettled the room. because it stripped away the drama they were expecting and replaced it with something far more difficult to process: humility. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, as if trying to reconcile the scale of what she had done with the simplicity of how she described it. And in that silence, something shifted again, not in the room this time, but in him, because power had always been something he measured in outcomes, in numbers, in control. But this had come from awareness, from listening, from something he had overlooked not just tonight, but for longer than he wanted to admit. One of the executives finally spoke, his voice cautious, almost hesitant. "Where did you learn that language?" he asked, and Naomi glanced briefly in his direction before answering. "College," she said. "I studied international communications for 2 years." There was a pause, just long enough for the implication to settle, for the unspoken question to form in the minds around the table, and then another executive added, unable to hide his curiosity. "And now you are working here?" Naomi nodded once, not defensive, not apologetic, just factual. "Yes, sir," she replied, and the room absorbed that quietly, because it did not fit the narrative they had constructed. It did not align with the assumptions they had made, and those assumptions, once comfortable, now felt incomplete. Ethan's eyes did not leave her, not because he was searching for an explanation, but because he was recognizing one, the kind that does not come with credentials or introductions, the kind that reveals itself in moments that cannot be staged. He took another step closer, closing the last of the distance that had once defined their interaction, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something stripped of performance. "Why did you not say anything sooner?" he asked, not accusing, not questioning her decision, but genuinely asking. Naomi considered the question for a fraction of a second, then answered with the same calm clarity she had held all night. "Because it was not my place," she said, and that sentence landed heavier than anything else she had spoken, because it exposed not just her restraint, but the structure that had taught her to have it. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of that answer settling into him, and for a moment, he looked away, not out of dismissal, but out of reflection, because he understood what she meant, not just in the context of the room, but in the larger pattern it represented, the invisible lines that decide who speaks and who stays silent, who is heard and who is overlooked. And when he looked back at her, the certainty in his expression had changed. It was still there, but it was no longer closed. It was open, aware, and deliberate. "Maybe it should have been," he said quietly, and no one at the table interrupted. No one added commentary, because they could all feel it. The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible now, not in grand gestures, but in small, undeniable truths, and Naomi, standing in the same uniform, in the same position, was no longer invisible, not to him, not to anyone in that room. The room did not return to what it had been, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and what had changed was not just the outcome of a deal, it was the understanding of who had shaped it. Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer, the quiet weight of realization settling into him. Then he straightened, not in the same way he had before, not as a man reclaiming control, but as someone choosing what to do with it. He turned briefly toward the table, his voice calm, composed, but carrying a different kind of authority now. "We will move forward with the revised agreement," he said, "and we will review our internal communication process before the final signing." The executives nodded, not because they were instructed to, but because they understood. This was no longer just about numbers. It was about precision, awareness, and the cost of overlooking either. But even as the conversation attempted to resume, something in the room resisted returning to normal. Because normal had just been exposed as incomplete, Ethan turned back to Naomi. And this time there was no distance left in his posture, no separation in his tone. "What is your full name?" he asked. And the question was simple, but the way it was asked made it matter. Naomi met his eyes, steady as before. "Naomi Brooks," she answered, and he nodded once, repeating it quietly, not for memory, but for acknowledgement. "Naomi Brooks," as if saying it out loud corrected something that had gone unspoken for too long. There was a brief pause, and then he asked another question, one that carried more weight than the first. "Are you planning to stay here?" The meaning behind it was clear, not about the shift, not about the night, but about the path she was standing on. Naomi hesitated, not out of uncertainty, But because she understood the question beneath the question, "I work here," she said carefully, her answer grounded in reality, not assumption, and Ethan gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if he expected that answer, as if he respected it. "That is not what I meant," he replied, his voice even, deliberate. "You have a skill set that does not belong in the background." The words settled into the room, not loudly, but firmly, because they did not challenge her position, they redefined it. One of the executives shifted slightly. Another leaned forward, listening more closely now, because what was being said was no longer just acknowledgement. It was opportunity. Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes sharpened, not with surprise, but with awareness, because she had heard words like this before: promises, possibilities, moments that felt like openings but led nowhere. And Ethan seemed to recognize that too, because he did not rush, he did not overstate. He simply continued. "If you are willing, I would like to speak with you after your shift," he said. "About a role where you would not have to wait for permission to be heard." There was no pressure in his tone, no assumption, just an offer placed carefully, deliberately. And the room, once filled with quiet dismissal, now held something entirely different: attention, respect, and a quiet acknowledgement that value does not always arrive where it is expected. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, measuring not the words, but the intent behind them, and then she nodded once, small, composed. "After my shift," she said, her voice steady, and with that, the moment settled, not as an ending, but as a beginning, because nothing about her uniform had changed, nothing about the room had physically shifted, but something far more important had: the way she was seen, and the way she chose to be heard. And as she picked up her tray once more, moving through the room with the same quiet precision as before, there was one truth that no one there could ignore: he had the power to run the room. But that night, she had the awareness to change it.